It's a funny thing, committing something to paper, especially when it's a book. So often, the moment you've typed the words, something in the world has shifted, which may either negate what you just wrote or, at the very least, provide a more nuanced framework for what you hadn't thought of. But too late, it's published and it's out in the world. So you either have to create a new edition or be satisfied with the fact that you tried to move the needle forward in some small way. No, thankfully, I'm not having these thoughts about my own book. Thank God. It's only been a month out so far. Give it time, I'm sure that will absolutely happen. But I was thinking for as much as things do change, there are some things that unfortunately don't. When I wrote Wholehearted Voice Pedagogy, I included a section in chapter 4 focusing on navigating issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Given my background as a white cis guy, I attempted to center the stories and insights of those who had experienced harm and had written about ways to create reconciliation. At one point, I was worried that this part of the book was perhaps not necessary, given the material covered in other chapters. But looking at where we are today, at least here in the United States, I'm so glad I kept it in. At a time when national and academic institutions are being forced to dismantle their DEIB programs, we need to keep alive conversations about what equity looks like, both in our society and within education. And that is precisely what we're going to talk about today. Hi, my name is David Sisco. My pronouns are he, him, and you are so very welcome to my podcast, Wholehearted Voice Pedagogy. This podcast is dedicated to the art and practice of teaching singers. It is an extension of my book of the same title, which was released by Routledge Press this past July, and you can now find it wherever books are sold. Today, we're going to talk about equity-centered teaching with the help of my very special guest, Alex Shevrin Venet. Alex is an educator, author, and professional development facilitator. She wrote one of my favorite books, Equity-Centered Trauma-Informed Education. I was reading it while I was writing my book, and I can promise you we are in for a real treat here. More on her in just a moment. But first, as we often do, let's define what equity is. According to the National Equity Project, equity is all learners receiving what they need to develop to their full academic and social potential. The Equity Literacy Institute makes an important distinction, though. They write, equity is not merely about giving every student what they need to succeed in an individual sense. This way of imagining equity obscures our responsibility to address institutional bias and inequity. Instead, equity is a process through which we ensure that policies, practices, institutional cultures, and ideologies are actively equitable, purposefully attending to the interests of the students and families to whose interests we have attended inequitably. By recognizing and deeply understanding these sorts of disparities, we prepare ourselves to respond effectively to inequity in the immediate term. We also strengthen our abilities to foster long-term change by redressing institutional and societal conditions that create everyday manifestations of inequity. Wow, that's a lot to chew on. And my hope is that today we can move beyond this kind of philosophical argument to the nuts and bolts of activating equity-centered teaching models in our voice studios. And with that goal in mind, it is my pleasure to introduce my very special guest, Alex Shevrin Venet. Alex, as I mentioned, is an educator, author, and professional development facilitator based in Vermont. She teaches graduate teacher education at Vermont State University. Previously, she was a teacher and a leader at alternative therapeutic schools, community college instructor, and after-school teacher in upper elementary school grades. Alex works with educators around the country to strengthen their trauma-informed education practices with a focus on empowering teachers to create systemic change. She's the author of the best-selling book, Equity-Centered Trauma-Informed Education, which has been integrated into teacher education programs in several states and has been cited in education research more than 250 times. Her follow-up book, Becoming an Everyday Changemaker, Justice and Healing at School, provides teachers with the tools to implement trauma-informed practices, starting where they are. Alex, welcome to the podcast. So glad to have you here.
Thanks, David. Thanks so much for having me.
It's my honor, truly. So in your book, well, first of all, before I kind of dive in, I just want to send some love your way. I, I know I've said this to you in email, but I just want to say it to you face to face that I was so lit on fire by your book that we're going to talk about today, your first book, and I'm really just grateful for it because it led me to continue writing the book that I just finished. And so thank you for your scholarship and for your commitment to equity-centered and trauma-informed care. It's really impactful to those of us who read your work.
Thank you, and congrats on finishing your book. It's always just fun to me when I get to hear from educators who aren't necessarily in the K-12 system about how this work is connected. I've heard from folks in nursing education, medical education, theater. I even did some work with someone who teaches folks educating others about tea, the drink of tea. And so it's always just, it lights up my mind to make all these connections to these other settings. So I always love to chat with folks.
Excellent. And chat we shall. So in your book, you outline the tenets of equity-centered and trauma-informed approaches to teaching. And on the podcast previously, we've talked quite a bit about trauma-informed care in the Voice Studio. And I'm just wondering if maybe for the purposes of our conversation today, if you can start by kind of talking about how equity-centered teaching intersects with trauma-informed care.
Yeah. So when I was working on this book, but just my work in general around trauma-informed education, one of the things that I kept running into is that folks would talk about trauma, but not really bring in the larger context in which trauma happens, and that larger context being things like systems of oppression and our political environment and identity and all these different things. And so I really wanted to make this connection with equity and justice. So equity really being this idea, you know, the catchy phrase people often use is equality is everyone gets the same and equity is you get what you need. And so this idea of equity is that we're taking into account context and identity and historical wrongs that maybe need some writing, and really trying to integrate all of that awareness into our offerings so that folks get what they need, both to access our education spaces and then during the experience of it. This really intersects with trauma-informed practices because inequities can cause trauma. And then once you've experienced trauma, you then can face inequities in your education experience. To me, it's really impossible to actually pull them apart. And so we look at them both together.
So smart. Thank you for that. You actually, in the book, you argue that educational spaces aren't often equitable for trauma-affected students. And can you explain why that is? I think you just touched on that a little bit more, but if you could maybe spin that out a little bit more.
Yeah. So trauma really can impact our day-to-day experience in our minds and bodies, as you probably talked about on your previous episodes. And so trauma can impact things like our capacity for attention, our emotion regulation, um, our, you know, general sense of feeling okay. And all of those things impact our ability to learn, right? So if I'm feeling really emotionally dysregulated and I come to you for my lesson and all of a sudden we're diving in on a really difficult thing right away, and I have no time to like orient or calm myself or get into the zone I need to be in for learning, I'm not getting as much out of that experience as someone who didn't have such a hill to climb around their emotion regulation. And then what trauma affected people often experience in addition to that is that all of those challenges then lead to what people call behavior problems in the education space. And then they're often disciplined for the behavior while people don't actually address the stress and the survival instinct that was underneath them. So that comes up so much in K-12 education. I'm not sure for you in the voice space about how that comes up, but I would have to imagine that, things like, missing your appointment or not following the cancellation procedure, all these different things that actually require quite a lot of executive functioning resources. Those executive functioning resources are depleted by trauma. And so then holding students all to the same standards and not having any wiggle room in how we address those can be a form of inequity that prevents students from being able to persist through their program.
I just want to underscore what you just said because I think it's so powerful that those who are trauma affected have diminished executive functioning.
Yes. Yes. So things like chunking a task, telling time, keeping to deadlines, all those, that word functioning, right? All those little things that are sort of the administrative parts of our life. If you are experiencing trauma or high deals of stress, all those things are much more difficult.
Yeah, there's so much here. And I just want to affirm that I absolutely see this play out in educational spaces and higher education. I see students who I perceive are trauma affected, and because of how they show up in a room, I perceive teachers have certain ideas about the level of commitment of a student, or a level of ability, when that may not be the case. And I think that's speaking to what you're talking about. Does that make sense?
Yes, and it's not just that executive functioning, but it's also part of the way that people show up having experienced trauma. And I'll say I'm making a generalization where there isn't always one, because trauma affects everybody differently, but there's some
Sure.
themes, right? So one theme that's really common in people experiencing trauma is that a lot of their mind and body resources go to protect themselves. And so you might see things like someone being less personable, being less trusting, seeming like they have their walls up. You also might see that person being really resistant to feedback, because feedback can feel like a threat. And that threat in our brains, there's no distinction between a psychological threat and a physical threat. And so if you have a student that's having a really hard time hearing corrections, hearing feedback, you can end up with a situation where that student, if they don't have a teacher who's really willing to be patient and work with them and figure out what's the best way for you to hear this, again, then they're facing this inequity, because then they're not getting the feedback because the teacher says, well, they're not going to hear it, or they're not able to persist because it's too overwhelming to hear that all the time. And so I think what all of this comes down to is sort of the teacher's ability to really be present for the student and to trust, hey, if you're coming here, it's because you're motivated to do this learning. And so I'm going to work with you and build a relationship to try to understand how to best meet your needs here, rather than making assumptions on that kind of surface behavior.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, you've led me to my next question, which is how do we take an equity-centered approach? And so certainly starting with kind of like the large scale, which is being present, which we all know as a teacher can be very, very hard, especially as we get further and further along in the academic year. But then, like, student to student, are there recommendations you have for a student who may be argumentative, or conversely, a student who is just shut down and seems like they're disengaged? And I will say, having been in those spaces as a teacher, it's really hard not to take that personally. And I have to just continue to remind myself, it's not about you. It is not about you. It is about what the student, and as you said, the student is here. The student clearly wants to learn something. And so you have to meet them where they are. do you have suggestions for maybe, because to me, those are the kind of the dichotomies, right?
Mhm.
Somebody who's in like what I would consider hyper arousal versus hypo arousal.
Yes. Yeah.
Do you have some thoughts on equity centered training there or teaching there?
Yeah, yeah. So what I would invite people to do first is to back up and kind of answer this question, which Paul Gorski, who's an equity educator, asked this in his work, and then I modified in mine. He asked this question of how is inequity present here? And then in my work, I talk about how is trauma present here? And it's this question to sort of get you thinking about what is the context and the environment of my work, and how can I be aware of what students may be bringing with them and what they may encounter here that could be an equity issue. So for example, you might think about, what are the barriers to accessing my space, both maybe financial, those executive function pieces, but then also, who is traditionally supported to sing, who is traditionally barred, what types of voices and what types of bodies are seen as successful,
Mm,
what are the different issues, right? So really having an understanding, because one of the first things you can do to be equity centered is create an environment that really cues students into your dedication to this work. So for example, and I think you may have done an episode around this before. I was browsing your list. I think you talked about this a little bit, but maybe thinking about what's my language about gender and singing, right? Am I
yes.
using language on my website and in my lessons and in my program that includes students and really leaves it to them about how they're connecting vocal parts and gender, and kind of picking apart some of those associations that may be creating an inequity both of access and then of experience for those students. So you can do proactive things like that to really signal to students, I care about your safety, I care about your inclusion. And so that does a lot to help students come in and begin to build that trust. And then once they're in, and you have students who maybe are disengaged or who are combative or any of the presentations, like you said, I think it's this thing of holding two pieces together. One being, it's not about you, right? It's around their need to feel safe. It's around how they're navigating the world, but also it is about you, right? So you're part of that equation, right? And so
Sure.
what can I do to help signal I'm here, I care about you as a person, I'm invested in your success, and that we're in it for the long haul, right? So sometimes that can be just as simple as literally saying that out loud. I care about you, I'm invested in your success, I'm here for the long haul. And sometimes it can be in your policies or in how you're responding if a student comes and says, you know what, actually, I didn't work on what we said we were going to work on, or I didn't take your feedback on this thing. Are we responding to that with disappointment, critique, shame? Are we responding to that as, okay, great, let's problem solve around this? What was hard about it? What can I do differently? And really kind of owning our piece of things.
Yeah. Yeah. That's such sage advice. Thank you. Obviously, inequity can often be baked in to our educational institutions through policies and procedures. And you present some questions in the book on how to reflect on an institution's current policies. And I was wondering if you could share some of them and how they may be applied.
Yeah. One of the big questions before we get into some of the more minute ones, as I find my page here as well. My big overarching question around policy is, do my policies promote a culture of compliance or a culture of care? And so
Mm,
really thinking about this distinction of, are my policies intended to get people to do what I want for the ease of my business or for efficiency or whatever it may be? Or is it about a culture that's dedicated to the learning we're here to do, that sees people as whole people, all these types of things? And to be real, right, you have to balance it. Okay, right. So,
sure.
if you are running your own independent education space, you have to get paid, right? And so you're going to have policies that are about an amount of compliance around when are your invoices due or whatever. But there are ways that we can situate and frame those that really communicate our care, and not just a really punitive level of, you have to do what I say or else you are banned from here forever, right? So really
Sure.
thinking about, I can still get those logistical needs met while also the environment of care. So a couple of the questions I invite people to think about when they're looking through their policies. One is to just understand, what are the philosophical assumptions behind my policy? So in other words, what went into developing this? What does this policy say about what I think about humans, right? So for example, if you have a classroom list of rules that says, no swearing, no bullying, no this, no that, no whatever, versus a classroom rule that says respect everyone and be kind, right? One of those policies is built on an assumption that people are going to do all of this negative stuff, and the other is on an assumption that people are going to strive for a positive community environment, that they want that positive community environment. And so, it's a little simplistic of an example, but you can just think about, like, what am I communicating about my philosophy of teaching through the way that these policies are built. Similarly, you can also think about, are there cultural values that are baked into the policies? Are there certain norms? So for example, things like, showing respect. Respect has a really different meaning cross-culturally, cross different identity experience, just even family to family, right? And so thinking about, how can I be really clear about what that means and what I'm expecting? We also want to ask ourselves whether policies have potential to be enforced really differently across different groups. How are we monitoring for that and making sure that we're checking for bias as we go? And then just one other example I'll throw out is, are there unspoken lessons in the policy? So the example I give in the book around that is, some schools have this policy of, if you have perfect attendance at our school, then you get a prize or reward or recognition at an assembly. There are unspoken lessons in that, which include things like, it's better not to be sick than to be sick. It's better not to take time off than to take time off. And those lessons are actually ableism, right? Like, those are actually communicating negative things about, values about being sick or needing time away. And those aren't lessons we want folks to learn. And so I think, when I take all these questions together, it's really just about, let's not just repeat all the rules and policies that, we found somewhere because they sounded good or that were used when we went to a program or we went to school, but really get underneath them and say, is this contributing to the environment I actually want to build based on my values as an educator?
Yeah, there are a couple of things that I want to unpack in that. One is, what I heard you say was that it's not just about the philosophy behind that policy, but it's also in the literally the articulation of it. So the example that you gave of no, 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 and respect everyone, right? That those are very two different ways to articulate, right? I think that's really important. And also, this is such a great thing for, I think, all of us educators to start thinking about now, as for those of us who are getting ready to go back to either higher education or education. Like, this is the time to, like, every semester I pour over my my syllabus, and I'm like, what needs to be reworded? What needs to, what can I say better now that I have newer information, right? And really thinking about what equity and trauma-informed practices look like. How can I signal that to the person, the student, that's going to be entering my studio or my classroom? And then the last thing that I want to share is, as you were sharing just now, and the earlier question, is this thing that I often forget is, when a student comes to me, it's not only their potential past trauma, it's also like their past relationships with teachers that I'm also working, trying to often working past. tend to, I try to be very supportive, direct, and very kind. And some students are really thrown by that because it's
Mhm.
not, especially in the sphere of music, that is not how they have been taught. And so I realize like I have to be aware of their previous relationship with teachers as well, because that ties into all of this as well. Does that make sense?
It does. And it makes me think about, for those of you who are in higher ed and you're putting together something like a syllabus, one of the things that I like to do in my syllabus is in the different sections that maybe have policy language that I'm required to have by the college, or where I have a more formal policy statement that I kind of need to word in a certain way. I also will put little paragraphs in front of each of those sections and I'll say, this section, the purpose of this section you're about to read is to clarify X, Y, and Z. The reason that this section is here is because I want to make sure you understand what your rights are regarding accommodations, or just a little thing that puts it into plain language. And I think
Yeah,
that it's helpful as well in regard to what you were just saying with your style, is if you transparently say to folks, the reason that I teach this way is because I believe that in music education, X, Y, Z, right? So that you're being really clear up front that the reason David is being nice is not by a quirk, and maybe I have to worry that he's going to get really harsh later, or he's
yeah,
nice to the whole class, but he's going to be, really intense in my feedback. But to just be transparent, like this is what I'm working off of. This is my philosophy, and it helps calm that hypervigilance, that nervousness, and allows students to then, settle into that safety of, okay, what I'm seeing is what I'm getting, and I understand why.
Sometimes we as teachers can feel like we're a cog in a very big hamster wheel. And often, that we don't have the bandwidth or the agency to kind of speak up and create change when we see inequitable policies or procedures. And I know I've certainly felt that way as an adjunct in my years of teaching. And I know in part five, you underscore that teachers do have a lot of powers especially in in the individual classrooms, and so even within inequitable spaces. And so I was just wondering if you could lift a couple of those up.
Yeah. So actually, it's funny, since I wrote this book, Equity-Centered Trauma-Informed Education, I actually have gotten versions of this question every single time I talk to teachers about it, because I think there's this sense of, yes, I really want to do all of this, and the environment is challenging, and the environment has only gotten more challenging since 2021 when this came out. And so I actually wrote a whole second book just about that question because
Come on now.
I was getting it so much. The new book is called Becoming an Everyday Changemaker. And I really, in the whole thing, dive into this question of how do I find my influence, and where do I make a difference, given that everything is terrible. And so just a couple of things that I highlight in there. One is to remember that this work is really big and we can't do everything. And so I often say to teachers, you can't do it all, but you can get started, right? We cannot fix every single equity issue that there is. We cannot solve for all of the problems in our education environments, but there's something that we can do. And what that something is going to depend kind of on the intersection of what do I care about, and then where are my skills. And so what I encourage teachers to do are to really think about, okay, let me first make a list of kind of what I was saying before. What are the equity issues I see? Maybe what are some of the challenges for my student population? What are the things that are kind of bugging me? And I sort of feel that need to make a difference. And then in taking that list, then separate out what do I have absolutely no control over? And then what do I have maybe some amount of influence over? So, for example, if you're an educator and you work at a college and you are feeling really stressed about the fact that the college is not affordable for the students. You probably have actually no influence over that. However, you might have influence over how students are being made aware of the resources that actually are available to them. I know that when I taught at a community college, we actually had a good number of grants that were available for student crisis or, different learning grants and things like that, but it wasn't really transparently communicated. And so one of the things that I could do is really bring those things to the forefront, make sure students really knew about them, bring it into my conversations when students were saying, oh, I'm having a hard time in class because my car broke down. I could say, oh, we actually have a grant fund for that. And so even though you may feel powerless about the big issue, there may be smaller pieces that you can do something about. And then the last piece of this that I encourage folks to think about in finding your area to make a difference is what are the particular skills that you have as a change maker, even if you don't think of yourself as a change maker. Some people really love to stand up in front of a crowd and say something, speak truth to power. Other people, that would send you into hiding for months, but maybe that person is really great at building connections. And so they can start to gather like-minded faculty and say, what could we collectively do about this? Other people are really good at organizing the email list and the Google Doc and all of that. And so maybe they're going to offer to do the behind the scenes work on an issue, right? And so in the new book, I have sort of a list of some of those types of skills so people can kind of do a self-assessment. But you can do that just on your own of thinking, what are the ways that I might contribute through the particular skills, things I'm good at? So what am I good at? What do I care about? And then what do I have influence over? And then find that unique thing that is yours to focus on. And when we all do that, it really creates a huge collective impact.
Yeah. Oh, gosh. You have given such beautiful, concise, thoughtful answers to all my questions. And we have time and still. So before I let you go, I just want to know more about you as a human being doing this work, and maybe if you would feel comfortable sharing what's led you to this work. I mean, I read for our listeners your really impressive bio, and you've worked in lots of different kinds of educational spaces, which I'm sure has given you a lot of insights into this work. But was there we're being a theater-based practice, often we're big on story, and it's just wondering if there was something that led you to this work in particular.
That's a great question. I mean, I think that for me, it was a confluence of a lot of different things. I write a little bit about my story in the start of my first book and how I graduated college with a teaching degree, and it was during a recession. And so I had a public school job lined up that then went away because the person who was supposed to retire to vacate the role couldn't retire. And so I just sort of almost by happenstance ended up working at a therapeutic school where I learned so much of what I talk about now and sort of these approaches. And what was great about that was that before I kind of had the chance to get really, you know, indoctrinated in the way of things in public school, I was in this little alternative school learning these much more human-centered ways. And so it became my normal. And then in talking to my teacher friends who were at their public schools, or I would go to a conference or grad school, starting to hear about the way that they were, told to handle things, or their students, what they were struggling with, I started to go, oh, I really feel like these things that have become normal to me should be more normal in the system, and I want to bring them there. But of course, I think the seeds for all of this were really planted for me much earlier than that. I think that just maybe a confluence of different parts of my upbringing kind of made me receptive to all of this. I don't know if I can really pull them apart, but I'm glad that they led me here. And it feels like full circle to be talking with you because my husband's a musician and a theater music director for many, many years. I do some behind the scenes volunteering at our community theater. And so I feel like I'm bringing my hobbies and my work life together in this conversation.
I love that. Yeah, I thank you for sharing that. That's really that's really powerful to hear, and it just is a reminder that we all, we all have. I just believe we have a portfolio of gifts that we are uniquely qualified to use to the benefit of the students we serve. This has been such a fantastic conversation, which is not at all a surprise to me based on our interactions and just reading your book. And I can't wait to read the second one. I'm a little behind, so I'm gonna get on that, and I'll list both of your books in the show notes so people can check them out. But thank you for making time to talk with me today. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on.
On the last episode of the podcast, my guest, Billy Sauerland, said something that has really stayed with me these last couple of weeks. They said when certain words or phrases become buzzwords, they can sometimes lose their meaning. I don't know many teachers who would disagree with the idea of being equity-centered. But one does not simply become equity-centered because equity is more than a buzzword. It requires a daily interrogation of what that actually means and how that may shift with each student. It is a serious commitment, and of course it can be hard. But the thing I want to hit home is this. It can also be life-changing, and not just for the student, but for us as well. It has the potential to create connection and growth. It has the potential to slowly move the needle toward more equitable policies, more equitable institutions, and a more equitable industry. So in what ways are you already engaging in an equity-centered teaching practice? And how does that differ based on the student in front of you? What did you take from today's episode, and how can you apply it in your studio, individual by individual? I would love to hear from you on this. I think we all have a lot more to learn when it comes to equity-centered teaching. So as always, you can email me at wholeheartedvoicepedagogy@gmail.com, or you can connect with me on the socials. My handles on most platforms are at Sisco Songs and at Wholehearted Voice Pedagogy. I would be so happy to connect with you. And if you haven't already, take a moment and hit that subscribe button. And maybe even share this episode with a colleague you think would enjoy this conversation. More soon. Take care of you.